podcast that we cover the major histological sections that you see in Anatomy 1 lab. This one will cover the bulk of the muscle and nerve. So there are three kinds of muscle, which we're looking at one here. So our very first muscle that we will talk about today is skeletal muscle, and you can see this on the screen already. The other two are cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So the first one we discuss usually is skeletal muscle. It is the one that generally does have a few more characteristics to it, and skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle do have some similarities in common, and we'll discuss those. One of the first things you will note, this does look a lot like some of the connective tissues that you've looked at in the past. It does look like dense, regular connective tissue. One thing, though, you will note is when you look at each individual cell, they have more than one nucleus. The skeletal muscle itself is known as being multinucleated or syncytial, and has more than one nucleus according to each individual muscle fiber. In order to see this better, we need to zoom in. And as we zoom in on this highest magnification, we will look in and we will start seeing the structures that we can tell that this is a skeletal muscle. For one, you can see more than one nucleus, and if we go up here just a little bit, we can see another characteristic that highly distinguishes this tissue from many of the others. For one, you can see the very long, thin fibers with more than one nucleus to each fiber. And so there's two characteristics that we can look at. And the third one, notice the striations that we can see in these structures. There are, as we look at the fibers run from left to right on this screen, if you look in there, you will see faint lines that move up and down from the top and bottom inside each fiber. Those are referred to as structures called sarcomeres, which are formed by the cross bridges of actin and myosin that form these nice little linkages that you will learn about when you cover sliding fiber theory in your classes. So these things are the structures we would use to tell these tissues apart. The very long, thin fibers with more than one nucleus and having striations in them that form what we call the structure known as the sarcomere. So these is how you would tell this part from the other tissues plus the other muscle tissues that we will look at. Where you will find this in the body is all the major skeletal muscles of the body, everything ranging from all the major muscles you're going to be learning near the, just after the midterm exam, and everything ranging from there. So this makes up all the major skeletal muscles from your biceps, triceps, your abdominal muscles, and your diaphragm. So this one's pretty easy to tell, and its major functions is movement of the body, and this is usually thought of as being a voluntary muscle with the exception of the diaphragm, which is in itself both voluntary and involuntary. So generally you can think of this as being a voluntary muscle except for the diaphragm. And we'll move on to take a look at our next one, which will be cardiac muscle, in which we can see some distinctive differences. So we move to cardiac muscle, which makes up the bulk of makes up the entirety part of the muscular part of the heart, the non-venous portions. So this one has a very unique location. It's only found in the heart, and a few very unique characteristics about this muscle. One thing you will note about it is that the individual cardiocytes, or heart muscle cells, have a branched appearance to them, and they generally have a single nucleus to each one. And the nuclei aren't on the outside like they appear to be in our muscle fiber that was from the skeletal muscles. Now, to see the other characteristics of this muscle tissue, we must zoom in, of which there will be other characteristics we can see for this muscle. One that is generally not as easy to see on here is this muscle too is striated, which will give it the ability to do the linear contractions that the heart muscle will do. You can see the branched nature of these individual cardiocytes, in general, you should be able to see striations on these tissues. I mean, you will be able to see they are there. And other structures that you can barely make out in some of these tissues is a structure known as an intercalated disc. That's not one you can usually see on here too well. You will see a faint line going across that will hold one cardiocyte to another. And so those structures that you will see, the branched nature, striations, intercalated discs, and in general you will see that they have a single nucleus that are generally in the middle. Again, this place generally has one location in the body. This is found in the heart. One thing about this tissue is it does not regenerate, so once you lose heart muscle, it's gone. So this is a pretty unique thing. Of course, since it is only found in the heart, its function is to pump blood into the heart and in and out. So this is what's responsible for forming the thick muscular walls and muscular nature to the heart muscle itself, and is the only place in the body it is located. And we'll move on to the last one that has a few more locations in the body, and again, this muscle can be thought of as an involuntary muscle. This is one that moves without us necessarily having to. We don't have to think heartbeat, heartbeat. So as we move on to our next one, the smooth muscle, we'll see that it in and of itself is also an involuntary muscle. And these two are very deeply contrasted to our original skeletal muscle, which again was voluntary.
Are there cells in that, correct?
Alright, so the very last tissue, the muscles that we cover, is smooth muscle. This one is usually one of the easier ones to tell because of its lack of features. One of the things I usually note that it does look like is like someone did slice a piece of meat. It does look very superficially like a slice of beef. The thing about this tissue is that the individual fiber is very smooth, kind of elongated, but they look a little like squamous cells. They do not have striations. They do not have all those little peculiar structures like the cardiac muscle does and the skeletal muscle. So they are fairly uneventful in what they do have. So as we look at them, we'll zoom in just a little bit more to get a good look at it so we can tell this muscle a little bit better. As we can see, individual cells, which don't come out too well at this magnification because of the amount of light. They don't look like fibers and they don't look like branched structures. So we can distinguish this one pretty quickly from the other ones. The trick is trying to know it is a muscle. And this image here probably is the most definitive you'll see for it. The major locations for this muscle tissue, you'll find this in things like in our intestines, our stomach, and forming the parts that actually ring and cause the movements of food throughout our stomach. So these guys are responsible for forming causing peristalsis and things like that in the esophagus and throughout the digestive system. These are involuntary muscles, so they're found a little everywhere, generally not the muscle that you generally eat, so it's a little different. But its major functions, since it is an involuntary muscle, it has a variety of muscles, of functions of moving food through the digestive system and basically controlling how things can get in and out. So it has a wide variety of functions, but this one's a little uneventful as it comes to, it lacks all those other structures, a little more simple to find, but the best way to see it is zoomed out a little bit more. And the only way we can try to give descriptions of this, because you can't see the individual cells very well, that it does have this carved meat appearance. But in general, this is not one that I put on practical, so for those of you who are listening at home and in my classes, then you can be kind of easy that because this thing doesn't have as much as the other two, it's not one I usually put on a practical. But since it's an involuntary muscle, you'll find this forming things in the digestive system, and this is primarily what's responsible for moving food throughout the digestive system. So that does it for our muscles. the muscle tissues, and then we'll look last at the nerve, and that will be the end of all the anatomy slides that you guys are responsible for. And now we come to our last tissue that we discussed in all the histology section. This one is nervous tissue. It's a pretty straightforward and pretty simple to understand and see tissue. We can see at least a very faint neuron in the middle, the kind of globby looking purple that's a little darker and wider. You can see the major cell body of a neuron there. It is very difficult to find them floating around in here because it's just not always found. But the neurons will show up as being much darker. And now you do see, besides the neurons, you see a lot of the axons, and you see multiple dark spots over here called neuroglia, which are the supporting cells for that tissue. So that's just a few of the major things you can note on here. Nervous tissue, you will note the branching patterns for all the little dendrites, the spotting patterns for the neuroglia, and then when we run into a neuron in here, you'll note how it has a star pattern to that, of which we can see one here. This is the best one we've seen. So that's really a few of the structures that you'll notice on that are pretty evident that let you know this is a nervous tissue. Where this is located is the entire nervous system, and its function is to transmit nerve impulses, either senses or the senses of touch, taste, and smell, or the basic motor functions to innervate the muscles of the body in order to move the skeleton. So when it comes to that, it's a pretty simple, straightforward tissue, and that does it for all our tissues and concludes this podcast on the major tissues of the human body. And that will be responsible for the exams and practicals, and that is the end of this podcast.